Aloha, welcome to PTC 2020. I am Ayushi. I'm doctor candidate at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and I was PTC Young Scholar 2018. And we have Rob McMahon with us. He is Meheroo Jusawalla Prize winner for PTC 2020, and he is associate professor at University of Alberta, Canada. And today we are going to talk about his work. So, Rob, hi, welcome
Hi.
to PTC 20.
Oh, thank you.
Your dissertation title is very interesting, Digital Self-Determination. Can you tell more about it, and why do you think understanding about the indigenous communities, their culture is important for the business and the government? Like, what is the market there for the business and how the government can understand it better?
Yeah, sure. So I was going to say I'm clearly not an Indigenous person myself, but I got involved in doing that research in my doctoral degree at Simon Fraser University. And I was really interested in, particularly in Northern Canada, which still experiences quite a big digital divide. So going up there and seeing what people thought about the internet, what they thought about digital technologies, and then what impacts that might have on particularly traditional culture and language.
Okay.
And through my research there, I went up to northern Quebec, some of the Inuit communities there, as well as in northern Ontario. And through my research there with the people working on the ground to build and operate and manage digital infrastructure, came up with this concept of digital self-determination, which really sees sort of a blending between new cutting-edge technologies and then indigenous practices that have been happening for thousands of years. So I saw my role as a researcher as helping, sort of document and facilitate some of the discussions around that work, and then that took the form of my dissertation. As well as some issues around further research and policy development.
Oh, so can we say that you did some kind of participatory action research?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of the approach I take in my research. So when we talk about participatory action research, it's very much like the researcher working hand in hand with the community, with the research participants. So we don't talk about research subjects. It's not like, watching people at a window and writing down what they do, but very much going side by side and learning together about different issues.
Okay, so when you're doing that research, were you be part of some industry also who are helping you around setting up the projects for the community, or how have you gone about it?
Yeah, so actually it took about a year of work getting to know not so much the industry side, but nonprofit organizations that were set up by Indigenous groups.
Okay.
And so I got to know them, and these are the organizations that are actually providing telecommunication services in very hard to reach areas, right? So you imagine in the far north, it's cold, lots of snow.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you have to fly into these communities, or if there is a road, it's a winter road. It's only available, in the winter time. You might have seen that show, Ice Road Truckers,
Yes,
so that's
yes.
what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, so given those really challenging circumstances, I was working with the groups set up by Indigenous communities to operate services there. And so they kind of connected me with people on the ground, and then I went up there and did interviews and other research.
Okay, so I'm interested, like if we have the large companies and business organization or government trying to learn from the work which you have done, how they should go about it? So what kind of skills are required by the people who can do the kind of work you're doing? They mentioned participatory action research, talking to communities, anything like ethnographic skills. What do you think is required? Like, are these kind of people who can be recruited by the ICT companies? What should we do in the decade which is coming now in terms of skills of the people?
Sure, yeah, so I would say with participatory action research, like as well as doing the research hand in hand with the people who are actually on the ground doing the projects, a lot of it as well is what are the outcomes that are useful for those people.
Yeah.
So not of course, academic research, publishing in journals, that kind of thing is really important, but also what are sort of the policy implications, what are the ways to think about things like organizational development.
Okay.
So if groups are looking, whether it's industry or government, are looking to work with researchers, I think one way to kind of partner is through developing, reports, profiles, and things like specific policy recommendations that come about through that process of going through the research together.
And what about the cultural values and the preservation of the stories, which I think is your another project? Can you elaborate a bit about that? Because that is also important, and I think we Yeah, we'd like to know more about that project because that is also something which you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I have a project that takes a look at different forms of digital literacy. So working with high school students
Okay.
in First Nations communities, and in order to develop digital literacy skills training, we worked hand in hand with the community to figure out, what is the appropriate way to teach this stuff that's going to be useful for that particular community.
Okay.
And they were really interested in documenting traditional culture, right?
Okay.
So, for example, how do you put up a teepee? How do you build a sweat lodge? Like this kind of stuff. So the community wanted to learn that. They wanted to have a digital record of that. And so we thought, why not train young people to actually film that?
Yeah.
Think about data stewardship, data management. And then, of course, the infrastructure that supports that. So how do we actually introduce some concepts around, data centers, digital libraries, stuff like this, so that they're learning how to do digital skills in a way that kind of meets their community needs.
Okay. So can we say that this is the kind of the project which you're doing about the first mile connections also, where the needs are of providing the ICT connections, the kind of speed which these children would require for uploading their videos would be coming from the indigenous communities or people themselves? Can you elaborate more on the first mile related project with this now? Like, what were the needs?
No problem. Yeah, so the first mile concept kind of came about. There's been a lot of research over the years in that area. Actually, the UN Rural Development Agency at a global level talked a lot about the first mile connectivity with respect to like rural outreach and rural telecommunications. So we took that concept and took a look at that, applying that in the context of Indigenous communities in Canada, and found that it really resonated because it takes a look at, we always say there's typically the last mile of connectivity, which is that, as everybody watching this would know, the local connection. So if you and I are accessing the internet, it's the point that we connect to. First Mile tries to flip that around with respect to development policies and practices. So starting with the needs of the communities first. What are those people's interests and how they may want to use telecommunications, and then building out from there, how can they kind of be involved in that process. And so we use the First Mile as kind of a framework.
Okay.
Like a framing device within policy proposals, within organizational development, that kind of stuff. So how can we think about those things in a way that involves people in these communities, very diverse, in order
Can you
to
give some
meet their
examples,
needs.
like what were the projects which were done, where committees were involved? Maybe health related, something which you did?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's online health. Telehealth is quite a big application that's used in remote communities in Canada. So you can imagine, some of these communities, it's really expensive to fly people out if they're sick, or also fly experts in for things like diabetes testing. And so digital technologies really play a big role in that. And so by identifying health access as one of their core areas of priority, you can actually build a network that maybe prioritizes health data, for example. So make sure they have capacity for that use, given that there's very limited resources available to actually fund stuff because it's so expensive up there. So that might be one example, is how do you build health applications in a way that is possible using the funding and bandwidth and infrastructure available.
Okay, so can we say that last decade of telecom, and particularly we had a lot of discussion in PTC in the past decade, was about providing the last mile connectivity. We can flip the table now in the coming decade, and it would be more about the first mile. It can be more about the first mile connectivity to the people. Should we say that? What is your opinion about it?
Well, yeah, there's a few things I would say. I mean, in terms of maybe translating some of these findings to the Pacific context, we always say, like in the north, it's a lot colder, of course, but there are a lot of geographic similarities with respect to how telecom gets developed as here in the Pacific Islands. So you have small populations, you've got a lot of space between them. So how do you solve that problem of not just like the last first mile local connectivity, but also bringing connectivity to those regions? So I think some of the lessons we've learned in Northern Canada may be of interest here. With respect to, how the first mile can get used in different development approaches. I think about things like training local technicians, because it's often really expensive to fly people out, to fix networks, to manage networks. So how can systems be set up in a way that have more local involvement in that way, as well as applications development. We talked about health, education is another big one. We also talked about cultural preservation, language preservation.
Yeah.
So these are all potential online applications and even career paths for people living in these types of communities. So I think that's another thing we could see moving forward is how can we kind of craft on the ground development of jobs, of
Yes.
infrastructure, of systems, of applications that really are of interest to people living there.
And maybe use the word community leaders. Can you elaborate more on that thing? You're using this word community leader and leadership also.
Yeah, I think, or sometimes like the terms like technology champions.
Yeah.
So oftentimes doing the kind of work I do, you work with somebody who's, we joke about who's the geek in the community,
Yes.
right? So you find that person and they are often provide a wealth of information and like an entry point into, what are people actually interested in and what are some of the barriers that people face. And
Okay.
so I think that's really
interesting.
important.
So you have someone from the inside. But how do you maintain the fine balance between providing for the community and still not? So there's a fear of pushing things from the top-down manner,
Yeah.
but I think what you're recommending is bottom-up. So can you tell on the challenges which you have faced and how to maintain fine balance when we do such things in the coming decade?
I think that idea of, sort of focusing on not just, as you say, like the top-down approach or sort of the center to the periphery, but rather work with people on the ground to figure out what is the policy approach or the development approach that works for them. And that's always going to be a challenge. I think, as a researcher, I can speak personally, as you say, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't want to try to guide research
Yes.
too much. You really have to see yourself as a facilitator.
Yeah.
So your role is more about listening than talking in that way,
Yes.
like hearing from people, kind of going through iterations of how do you actually interpret what people are saying in a way that is useful to them and to their communities.
And I think that's what the business person and government should also learn from the work which you're doing.
Yeah, I think that issue of like meaningful
Respecting the
consultation.
indigenous and
Yeah, well, there's this concept of, there's a lot of talk of consultation, and I think the
Yeah.
idea of meaningful consultation and, really listening to people and, making sure that what they're saying is actually implemented in programs and policies is really important.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you all for listening to this. And I think the main thing which which Rob has communicated is that we need to do the meaningful consultation with the people. The consultation should not be from top-down manner, rather the meaningful consultation which should come from bottom-up. So first mile connectivity, bottom-up consultation, that's according to Rob for the coming decade, and that's all from all of us. Aloha and enjoy the PTC. Mahalo.